Welcome to Connecticut's Old State House. We're delighted to have you with us on this beautiful day. I know it was tempting to stay outside on a beautiful summer's day, so thank you especially for being here. My name is Rebecca Tabor Conover. I'm head of public programs here, and we are pleased to welcome you to this joint program between the Connecticut Public Affairs Network and our friends at the Coltsville National Park. Before we get started, and I think you're going to really enjoy today's program and learn a little bit about one of Hartford's luminaries, Sam Colt, I just wanted to mention a couple of things to you. On your chairs are a survey we would ask you to please fill out, and also our rack card with the last few summer concerts that are coming up. And actually, we don't have one on this Friday, but the following Friday is Val Ramos, and that'll be a wonderful concert here as part of the Farmers Market. I also wanted to mention to you that there is a handout that you can take about the Colt Park, and we have those out for you, so if you want to just grab that on your way out, please feel free to do so. You can tell that we are on film today, and our friends at the Connecticut Network are taping this program so that if you want to watch it again, you can. It will be on CTN and also available for download, and you can share it with a friend. And so it is my great pleasure today. Today's program is a little different than our usual conversations at noon. It is a straight history lecture, and all about one of Hartford's most notable folks, Samuel Colt. And our speaker today, we've had the pleasure of getting to know Bert Barnett. He has been a student of history since his youth. He grew up outside of suburban Atlanta, Georgia, and his first vacation was to the battlefield of Chickamauga, where, unknown to him at the time, his great-great-great-grandfather had fought. He is a 1984 graduate of Middle Tennessee State University, and he holds a BS in history with minors in English literature and psychology. For over 30 years, he has served with the National Park Service in a number of primarily history-related sites, mostly Civil War. And his studies in this area have led him to a growing appreciation of 19th century industry and technology, which was first introduced to him when his father gave him a replica of a Colt Navy revolver in the 1970s. And so please help join me in welcoming Bert today. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca, for that introduction. I'd like to comment very briefly. I see that history is taken seriously by a lot of young people based on the ornaments around the windowsills here, the projects that folks have taken time to put into, and that warms my heart, because a lot of times when I deal with folks at various parks, I see a lot of faces not unlike my own in terms of more hair on the sides than on the top. And so to see the effort put into it by the young folks is heartening to me. One of the things that I also want to touch on very briefly, although we're going to be focusing primarily today on Sam Colt, also going to go a little bit beyond his life and touch very briefly on the experiences of his right arm, you might say, and that would be Elizabeth Colt, although not in the depth that some would like. It's a little harder to get good, deep information on Mrs. Colt because, frankly, a study has not been done in quality of her life. No one has done a decent, in-depth biography of Elizabeth Colt. So if there's any aspiring historians out there, I would challenge you, beg you, that is a field that's rich in prospect, but shallow so far in product. So that's something that folks out there really ought to do. One of the folks that she did mingle with on occasion on a social level was a fellow by the name of Charles Dudley Warner, who was a writer and a quipster and a social philosopher at the time, an equivalent of Mark Twain in some ways. He helped Mark Twain write the Gilded Age. And looking over some of the things that he wrote, to deviate here for just a moment, one of his quotes is, "It is fortunate that each generation does not comprehend its own ignorance. We are thus enabled to call our ancestors barbarous." which is something to think about when we look at what was done in the past, and especially as we reflect over what's taken place in these last few days. It's something to think about. But it's also worthwhile taking a look at any figure from the past, and I think it serves as a good introduction to somebody who affected the present by what he did in the past, and it's kind of a good introduction to our subject of the moment, Samuel Colt, because he helped go from the agricultural period of the past to the industrial times of the present. And Sam Colt, the life of an American armsmaker, certainly reflects that. Now, Sam Colt is, or was, one of 7 children. He had 3 brothers and 3 sisters. As a result of that, in the household that he shared, he didn't get a great deal of focused love and attention from his parents. His mother died early, probably as a result of all of that effort. His father was busy with a silk mill in Ware, Massachusetts, even though Sam was a Hartford boy and they were based in Hartford. The business of running that silk mill in Ware, Massachusetts probably distracted him, in addition to the fact that Sam was always a quizzical child, one of those that would come up with questions like, if the earth was made of ice cream and it began to melt, where would it drip to? You know, that sort of thing. And so the frustrations that Sam's father probably felt in dealing with all of those kids, and especially with someone like Sam, led him to appreciate what I would call the indenture years, the ability to find a way to deal with Sam. He didn't have much time to reflect on the bonding with the children. This would affect Sam in many ways, and it would generate a personality that would strive ultimately in Sam for success at all costs. Get that attention, get that success, push forward, continue to push forward. As with many of us, it took time to get there, and when it did, it would reap its rewards in a great many ways. Now, I mentioned that term indenture, and that's exactly what would befall Sam at a young age. His father would seek the opportunity to get Sam out of the house at a young age, and he became an indentured field hand to a family in Glastonbury. Now, of course, he had to work during the day, but at the end of the day, he would be rewarded with a chance to peek into the family's library, well appointed as it was for that time period. And Sam stumbled across a book that would satisfy some of his curiosities, some of his wanting to know things. And at the age of 11, he would be able to learn more than most kids at that age would do. He was also introduced to the things inside that book, the knowledge of the invention of the steam engine, Robert Fulton, and things of this nature, and he would begin to want to know more. He had also inherited his grandfather's flintlock pistol that had belonged to Major John Caldwell, this from his mother's line when the estate was settled. And Sam delighted, like many young boys would do, in firing anything that goes flash bang, and he was probably something of an annoyance in the neighborhood when he did that. But explosives always delighted the boy, therefore, and it also cut short his schooling. In 1829, after he left school, he began to work in his father's mill. Now, when he was at the mill, he decided, through the time that he was working at the mill, to celebrate the 4th of July in a rather very unique way. Having learned about some of the new science and the new technology of the period, one of the ways he was going to demonstrate this was to show everybody just what he knew. He got a hold of a small barrel of gunpowder, and he was going to set this barrel of gunpowder off, not just with a fuse and out in the field like most folks might do, but he was going to actually have this detonate underwater with an electrical cable that was wrapped in waterproof, and then at the end of it, it would go into the barrel, and he would detonate it underwater to blow a raft off of the surface of the water. And of course, he sent out invitations for this, and so everybody came out on the 4th of July, 1829, to witness this. And of course, they all did. But of course, Sam's timing was off, and when he pushed the button to detonate this thing, the raft had drifted slightly off, and instead, everybody there was inundated with this tremendous spout of mud and water. And of course, Sam's father's a businessman. He's conservative. He's trying to keep everybody, impressed and on his side. And here's his son doing this debacle thing, and the son almost got run down by the ticked-off crowd there. So his father decides, this boy is too much trouble. This boy ain't right. I've got to do something else. The year in the fields didn't do much. So at that point, he will decide to get something arranged to get the boy out of town, make him work a little harder, a little longer, a little time, maybe on a ship on the deck of a freighter called a Corvo. And that's where, again, Sam will be out of town for a while, let the crowd cool down about this. But Sam continues to learn from his experiences. He sees things that are going to stick with him. And the image that you see there is what I call Sailor Sam out on the monument, the Colt monument there at Colt Park along Wethersfield Avenue. And what Sam will do in that year will continue to work, but he will continue to observe. And what he observes is very interesting. Now, he will go to India on this freighter, but this freighter, any good freighter hauling cargo, is going to be a modern technological device. You have the lines, the ropes that will work the sails. You will have the modern wheel of the freighter there. All of these things are let out or rotating and locked by locking capstans that spin and stop. Now, Sam sees this. He also sees something out there that catches his eye. He sees another handgun that's out there. It's an early revolver called a Collier. It's an American invention, but it's very awkward. It's a flintlock revolver. It has to be reprimed just like the pan on an old musket every single time. So if you want to shoot it 4 times with a full load of its cylinder, you have to reprime the pan every single time for the flint and steel. Very awkward. So what Sam sees is the opportunity, since now they've invented the percussion cap, is the opportunity to change this thing and improve it using those locking capstans that Sam sees on the ship. Now, on the way back to Boston, he will whittle. Sailors whittle. It's what they do. And he will show an improved version of his device made out of wood, and that's the inset there, is the cylinder, the hammer, and the cylinder pin. He will show this gadget to his father, and his father will say, no, son, I don't want you to spend time on this. Number one, you can't get a patent on a hunk of whittled wood. It has to be a real working device. And Sam will decide, I don't want to spend my time doing factory job. I want to go out and I want to do something on my own. How many of us have ever tried to raise a child? Okay, well, this is going to be Sam's father's lot, because his son, knowing something about chemistry, bleaching and dyeing, knowing something about the new chemistry that's out there. One of the things that's out there in the new chemical world is laughing gas, nitrous oxide. And Sam figures he can raise a little money by being a showman. Now, by this time, he is almost grown to his full height, which is going to be 6 foot 1 inches tall. And so he will have something of a self-possession about him. He's been out in the world. He's been all the way to India and back. And he will go out and reinvent himself as Dr. Colt. Dr. Samuel Colt, C-O-U-L-T, of New York, London, and Calcutta. And for just a little pittance of money, he will be able to get vessels of nitrous oxide, and he will be able to perform stage shows and have you come up and take a hit of laughing gas, and you can be whatever you want to be. A small man can be a roaring lion. A tall fellow, always embarrassed about being the tallest fellow in the crowd, can now be a mewing cat. And not only will they be what they want to be, but the audience will get a tremendous laugh out of this. And he will go from being a sideshow performer to being a fellow who fills all the seats in an auditorium. Now, he could have done what he wants to do with this, but number one, this image of being Dr. Colt will sometimes have its own side effects, because traveling across the Northeast, traveling all the way to the Ohio River, will occasionally mean that he runs into different circumstances. And at one point, he will be on a boat on the Ohio River where he will be in a circumstance where he will run into some folks that have cholera. And since he actually is supposed to be Dr. Colt, he will be asked to treat all of these folks with the cholera. Well, all he has is laughing gas. And he knows darn well that, that's not going to do any good. But they plead onto him, please do something for these poor people. And he gives them hits of laughing gas. He may not help them, but he's going to leave them laughing. But ultimately, he will be able to get a patent out of all of this because he raises enough money to get a fellow in Baltimore by the name of John Pearson to produce something they can actually get a patent out of in 1836. And his patentable revolver will begin production in Paterson, New Jersey, at the Great Falls of Paterson, another national park, if I can put a plug in for that. And this engineering city laid out by Alexander Hamilton will begin to be the place where the revolver is produced, and they produced that from 1836 until 1842. Unfortunately, the timing is bad because in 1836, the economy will begin to deteriorate. 1837 goes into full-fledged panic. Now, we don't use that term anymore, but it means that the government is not going to be able to buy anything expensive, and these revolvers are expensive. They're only about halfway machine done. The rest of them are hand done, and so it does cost a lot to buy one of those. The only people who are going to really buy them are those folks who are really going to need them. And so Sam, even though he considers himself to be something of an entrepreneur, that's his factory in Paterson, New Jersey, and that's him in the white there standing proudly in front of it down in the lower center. He's not going to be able to make his way in the business world at that point.
Is the factory still there?
In ruins to some degree, yes. Now, however, he does make a... I'm sorry? I thought I heard a question. Okay. Now, he is going to be diverted in another way, however, at this time, because during the time that he's having difficulty with his business, he does have the moral support of his brother. One of his brothers, and one of his brothers that's going to be the most interesting at this stage of his life is a fellow by the name of John. John Colt. John Colt will be a fellow who for a time is in the Army until he doesn't like it and he forges his way out. He will also be a thespian for a time with some of the theater groups in Cincinnati for a time, and then he decides he wants to become an accountant, and then when he decides he wants to be an accountant, he will write a very good book on, quote, how to keep a double set of books, which actually is an acknowledged form of being able to be a bookkeeper. That goes through 9 sets of printings, but it still leaves him in the hole for a fee of $70 to his publisher, and at some point he will get in a fight with his publisher, and his publisher will wind up in a difficulty with his brother. But at that point, the line has not gone all the way on John yet. At this point, John and Sam are involved romantically, not with each other, but in a triangle with a woman by the name of Caroline Henshaw. And Caroline Henshaw is going to be an interesting subject because we don't know amongst the three of them exactly where the baby on Caroline's shoulder comes from. But that's going to be an interesting story later on. We do know that when John murders his publisher, the only one of the folks that loyally stands by John when John goes to trial and John is eventually found guilty is Sam Colt. And when John is slated for execution, it's going to be interesting. There's going to be a jail cell marriage of John and Caroline to give the baby a name. And just before John will be executed, there will be a fire. When the fire is put out, John will be lying there in his cot with a knife through his heart. And now Sam has a nephew, and Sam will refer to this child as his nephew, in quotes, until the day he dies. Already interesting. Very interesting side story about all of that. But the child is referred to as Samuel C. Colt, Samuel Caldwell Colt, as his nephew. But Sam is trying to make his way business-wise in the world at that point. He's not able to successfully do that. What he is trying to push at this point is not the story of his brother. He's trying to get his brother out before the murder, and before the judge comes down on that. Doesn't actually work very well. But this is all very bad for Sam's business at this point, because he's trying to push after the Revolver story fails, he's trying to push his line of harbor defense against again, a glorious device that's supposed to improve the sales figure for Sam, make money when the Revolver device fails. But that's not going to work either. Yes?
Correct me if I'm wrong, but you said that John married Caroline in the jail cell.
In the jail cell, yes.
And then after that, what happened was Sam married her? Oh, I'm sorry. Sam married her?
No, Sam did not marry her. She actually goes with the child and goes away from New York for a while, and they kind of fade off and are not found for a while until she reappears later on after Sam's death in 1862. But we'll touch on that in a little while.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry. Thank you
Yes.
very much.
Yeah. Yeah. Ultimately, what will happen at this point, because Sam, once all of this happens, when this all happens to John, and John dies, Sam is still at the very tail end of his gun business in the first shot of it in the Paterson enterprise, which fails in 1842, which is about the time that the trial is taking place. Sam will see his gun business collapse, and that's why he moves off to the harbor defense that you see here. Again, he never really got away from the idea of blowing up anything, and the idea of selling large boxes of gunpowder that he can put under harbor entrances instead of the government buying and manufacturing large forts instead is an idea that appeals to him. He tries to sell that, but that does not work very well either. You'll see the John Quincy Adams reference in the lower corner there, and John Quincy Adams thinks it's, quote, an unchristian infernal contraption, and so that will be his primary block in the government for that. And to do that, of course, it all relies on electrical cable, and Sam actually works with Samuel F.B. Morse to do that for a time. And of course, Morse goes on to work with the telegraph, and the only difference being Sam's electrical charges sends a message of death, and Morse sends a more positive message to a variety of telegraph subscribers. So Sam, for a time, is out of the gun business until the Paterson firearms that are manufactured actually begin to see a more productive end when the economy picks up and the strife in Texas begins to assume a national proportion in the mid-1840s. And you'll see two fellows in the image here that are of importance, Texas Jack Hayes and Samuel Walker. And Samuel Walker is a Texas Ranger who will seek improvements on the old crude Paterson design and begins to look for Samuel Colt. And when Samuel Colt is found, he tells Walker, look, I'm out of the gun business. I'm not doing that anymore. But Walker tells him, I am now not just a Texas Ranger. I am now with the United States Mounted Rifles. We're about to go to war with Mexico over Texas, and I bring not just my personal interest, but a checkbook. And if you make improved pistols, we will give you improved money. And we're talking 1,000 pistols at $25 a pop. Now, in 1846, that's real money. And Sam's eyes begin to widen, his ears begin to perk up, and he says, I think I know somebody who can help me with this. And so they will go to New Haven. They will produce an enhanced Colt revolver, and that may be familiar to some of you. But you'll see the trigger guard on the bottom of it there, so the thing does not slip out of your hand on a bolting horse. You'll see a loading lever underneath the barrel, so you can load it and reload it without having to tear the gun apart. and it is a .44 caliber, much heavier powder load as well. In fact, some of the men who are working with this gun for the very first time load the bullet in backwards and the whole thing explodes. So it does have its negative qualities to it. But it is what gets Sam noticed not only in the United States military, but we watch each other's militaries today. They did in those days as well. And the Turks, the Russians, the Germans, the English are all impressed with this thing, and they say, we want this too. And so this will begin for Sam an entirely new time in his career. And of course, once the Mexican War is over and gold is discovered in California, that market will open up as well. Not just for the big pistols, but also for the tiny ones, ones that can fit in your pocket, medium-sized ones you can put on your belt. And for those folks interested in the Hartford story, if you take a look at the picture on the lower corner there, the factory and office initially located at Grove Street, part of the original architecture that was lost, I understand, during the enhanced redevelopment of downtown some years ago. Yeah, you can see the painting there for the washing that was done there, but if you look above that, you can see the old faded COL just before the gutter line there, the initial building that the Colts were made in. Yeah. Sam would unabashedly advertise, "My arms make the best peas makers," and he would spell that Peesmakers. He was a terrible speller, but a tremendous marketeer. He would hawk his wares to all, using national and local conflicts to create and magnify demand. But he would go on the road and sell these things all over the place. He would go to the Crystal Palace in London, set up an exhibition there in 1851 where he would highlight the goods. And it was there, I suspect, that he became enamored of glass as building material that he would later put on the back of his own house. Business would be swift there. He would also visit the Sultan of the Turks and deal with them. He sold him 5,000 of his largest frame pistols, which is convenient because at that moment they're at war with the Russians. And after he came up to Moscow and met with Tsar Nicholas I, he said, "By the way, you know that the Turks have 5,000 of my latest model pistols. It might be wise for you to buy about 5,000 of my latest pistols to defend yourself against the Turks." And then he would go slightly east to the Germans and say, "You know, by the way, I just left points east of where we are now, and those folks have about 10,000 guns just like this. Aren't you concerned? Don't you think that it might be a good idea to arm up?" But then when he got home, he had money coming out of his pockets, and he was able to step up on a higher social register and approach the eye of his idol, which would be Elizabeth Hart Jarvis Colt. Colt later, after 4 years of finally getting a proposal in 1852. And you might wonder why it takes 4 years between proposal and marriage. Well, part of it goes back to that tortuously delivered story a little while ago with his brother. Part of it also goes with having a sister, Marguerite, who was a second ran in a marriage scenario as well. She had not been selected by a particular fellow to be engaged, and she was still invited to the ceremony, and when she decided to go anyway, she decided to pick up the invitation and buy a dress and go out to the ceremony where the fellow was going to get married. She decided, "I'll buy a new dress and I'll buy a little bit of poison." Her intent was to go out on the dance floor in this new dress and then drop dead right there in the middle of the dance floor to ensure that she would be the talk of the ceremony and not the fellow who was going to get married. However, the poison worked a little faster than she thought, and she died right there in the bathroom. So that's why it takes Elizabeth and her family a little more than 3.5 years, 4 years to reconcile the fact that, Elizabeth is really and truly enamored with this fellow. But she writes in her diary upon their first meeting that, quote, he was a quick, high-tempered, impulsive man who fairly awed me with the magnetism of his presence. More than any other, he filled my ideal of a noble manhood, a princely nature, an honest, true, warm-hearted man. Part of this may have been the fact that when Sam proposes to her, he gives her a 7.5 carat plus sized diamond that originally had been given to him by Charles Albert, King of Sardinia, the first gift he had ever received from nobility. He had it reset into her engagement ring. And he will also make no post-engagement trips overseas. The rest of his business overseas he will do through agents. He and her bond very closely together. They have compensating factors. He is a very hard-nosed businessman, but he does have a soft side. She is very focused on certain things. She is very much a high Episcopal, deeply based, faith-centered person, and she always has her eye out for what's going on with other people. And that's a very unique combination to have a person of one sort and a person of the other sort meet. They compensate for each other and create a really unique personality. She is 12 years younger than he. She's born in 1826, the first child of a prominent Episcopal minister. There are military and political folks in her family tree as well. And they just distinguish each other and compensate for each other as well. Now, about the time they get married in 1856, it's going to be a rather interesting time for each other as well. Sam is creating a new factory. The smaller one just will not be able to meet the orders that are pouring in, both nationally and internationally. He will build one on the south portion of the town, and many markets will be addressed by what he produces. Again, the folks are looking, folks are looking to take the, quote, Hartford Hardware and make it a part of what they daily equip themselves with. Notice the photograph there. All of these ruffians seem to have something made in Hartford by their side. My arms are the best peacemakers, again, writing to his English associate Charles Manby in 1852. They will also settle down at the end of Wethersfield Avenue. The front of the house, as we would tend to think of it, is not the front of the house that will be completed in early 1857. Sam builds not only the house, but he will also build an entire factory town. A couple of different views of that here. The side of the house that you see emphasized here is more the side of the house that the Colts will spend more time at. And of course, you see the influence of the English with the conservatories, the glass windows and whatnot, for them to be able to experience all of the plants and the vegetables and whatnot that they would have access to with the extended growing season of those conservatories. They're both very much into plants and vegetables and whatnot. They will indeed have greenhouses on the lower portion of the property that they have. Sam buys 250 acres so that he can have his enhanced factory. He will also build homes for his workers. And this is a rather unique thing. After traversing Europe and seeing what Sam will write as the degraded state of European labor, he wants to make sure that his workers will be decently taken care of. And a part of that utopian worker factory boss relationship is decent housing for his workers. But he knows that that will also make them more comfortable and less likely to be uncomfortable by having seeds for disruptive conditions. He really does care for the workers. Now, this is a view of the 1880s, well after Sam is deceased, but in the factory that will be there along the Connecticut River, what we now call the East Armory, this is a view of your standard workstations. Belt-driven machinery, stepped down to the particular needs of the particular machines that they would have. pay for a 10-hour day, depended on the work that you did, but it would be not just compensatory, it would be generous. If you were a filer in the Colt factory, you would get $3 a day for the job that you did. There were also cleanup stations inside the factory. Now let's think of this, it sounds really generous, it's a little less than really generous, but it makes business sense as well. If you're going home to one of his apartments, he doesn't want you stinking of machine oil glittering with bronze filings as well. It does have a particular cycle to it, but it is also enlightened management of the period. Now, of course, all of this is on floodplain, and one of the things that Colt was very much aware of is that rivers will up and flood. When the factory was being constructed in 1854, the Connecticut River would have one of its 1-in-1,000-year floods, and it would raise over its banks and fill some of that early construction and coat many of the early machines that were put down there with a coating of mud that had to be cleaned off. So Sam had to restart the factory after doing that. So he had to build the dike higher. So dikes and that sort of thing were very much on his mind as part of the original engineering for all of that area. So one of the things he noted was that there are people who are very good at helping make sure that that wouldn't happen again. In his business travels, he noticed there were people whose job was specifically to tend dikes and tend the plants that reinforced the dikes. And if you're down towards the area of Kirkham Street, you will notice a line of houses that were built specifically for the German workers that were brought to that part of Coltsville for that purpose. And wrong direction again. Technology is not my friend. These houses here on Kirkham Street are just a portion of that. Some of them have been modified a little more than the others, but these are probably the best retained and best readjusted as far as what the originals might look like. Sometimes they're called Swiss cottages, sometimes Potsdam cottages for the German workers. And Sam actually brought the entire village out to Connecticut so that their job would be to do that. Now, one of the interesting things about that, how many of you remember when the Japanese car companies started factories in the United States? Okay. And anybody remember some of the fun that was made about that? Because not only would they build the factories, but they tried to have these sing-alongs with the factory songs and the work times and everything else like that. Okay. Part of what they were trying to do there was to indenture company loyalty. Well, Sam had the same idea. He had purchased band uniforms, band equipment, things like that for his workers, and a lot of the English workers at first didn't really have much tick with that because, I'm here to do my 10 hours and go home. But the Germans were used to working as groups. They wanted to come over as a group with their family, with their kin, things like that. They came over, they saw the band materials there and went right to it. And that warmed the cockles of Sam's heart because it was all factory, it was all kin, it was all part of the team. And so they picked that up, and the Colt band became a social part of the Hartford fabric until just about the time of World War I, when German things were, again, kind of not well appreciated around this part. So they would be socially part of that. Now, the image that you see here is with the whole factories line out here. You've got all those German cottages. You've got the Gnädige Fraus out there working with the cows. The smaller factory out there, because the Germans also cut the crop off the top of the dike, and the material that they would cut off the dike, the osiers, otherwise known as the wicker, would be utilized for particular products that they would make. And got a view of that. In this case, a crib that they would manufacture, and the byproducts that they would make would never rival the firearms, but they would be a separate part of the Colt empire here. And of course, diversification was all part of what they would work with as well. And this particular crib was actually one that the workers gave to the Colts when it was known that Mrs. Colt was going to begin to have children. But of course, like I said, the Wicker business was never as profitable or as long-lasting as the firearms business. The actual factory that did the Wicker business would burn down in the early 1870s. But of course, Sam himself was much more into the firearms end of it, and into the latter 1850s, with the pressures on the United States to try and keep together being very strained, you would see a lot of marketeering to various southern factions. And here's Sam passing out firearms to various southern contingencies that are interested in doing business at that point. What Sam would chase would not be necessarily unity, but dollars, and he would do that from time to time. Braxton Bragg, soon to be a Confederate general, Benjamin McCullough of Texas, one of his old Texas buddies, that would be rife for other marketing as well. You know, an agent in early 1860 wrote the following here: "I could sell a great number of the shotguns if I had the proper confidence in them. As it is, you will receive a number of orders. Last trial before General Gist at Union, South Carolina, took me all evening to pick out the powder and pieces of lead out of my face. No use telling a person to hold their to hold their head back. Might as well try telling them to hold it under their arm." And of course, their salesmen would go all throughout the South doing the same sort of thing. But Sam was politically sensitive. For a time, he would actually change the stampings on the pistols that were coming out of his factory. You know, and you'll notice the barrel stampings on the pistol here. For a time, he got rid of the New York City and went actually back to Hartford to try and alleviate any of the ambivalencies anybody might have towards buying his products, but then eventually went back to New York, with the Hartford being only a short-run indicator of that. But of course, ultimately, his business, his base, was the Union, and we have an indication of that. He would present pistols to folks on the Union side in great prevalence as well. Lieutenant Alexander S. Webb, who would later become General Alexander Webb, the federal commander at the Angle at Gettysburg, received actually two pistols, one when he graduated from West Point. It doesn't hurt that your father is also the editor of a major New York paper, you know, that this sort of thing would happen. You know, of course, when war does actually break out, it will be very good business for the Colts, but it also is going to be the end of a certain level of personal happiness at this point. Eventually, 375,000 handguns will be sold to the government during the Civil War. Sam will press the limit, however, and sell to the southern states and known sympathizers until Lincoln's ban on all trade with the South on the 15th of April, 1861, following the firing on Fort Sumter. Remington had done things differently, excuse me. They had quit filling suspicious orders following the election in November of 1860. But Colt had even considered setting up satellite factories in Georgia or Virginia just prior to the outbreak of the conflict. You know, he had dealt with particular people who had sources of iron and potential factory locations. This particular fellow in the inset here is a gentleman by the name of Mark Cooper, and he had been a congressman in Georgia and operator of an ironworks in similar sort of arrangements near a place called Etowah, Georgia, and it would be one of the targets of Sherman's folks when they come through there in 1864. But they had potential dealings with Colt in that arrangement. He had hoped to do business with Colt in the time prior to the outbreak of the war. But the stress of the war, as well as domestic stresses, had begun to take their toll on Samuel Colt. Colt, who had never made a single shot anything, gets the first contract with the War Department for shoulder-fired muskets, the regular infantry musket that the Union Army will use when it goes from a 15,000-man army to trying to expand to a 100-plus thousand-man army as the volunteers begin to pour in. But he's very ill by this time. He had told Elizabeth that he was not going to leave and go anywhere by ship after after they had gotten married, but he will begin to take boats to Cuba to try and get better for his health. He has gout, too much acid in the blood, probably a result of too much stress. He is definitely a AAA type personality, and you would not know that he's only 46 in this picture. But the pressures that he's under, the fact that he has witnessed deaths of his small children at this point, when his first daughter dies, the descriptions that I have read give the impression of, how many of you have seen Gone with the Wind? Okay, when Rhett Butler's daughter dies, and he gets that terribly drunk, emotionally chewed up, depression fit. That's the sort of thing I envision from what I have read about what Sam Colt goes through when his first daughter dies. He is just really terribly chewed up by that. And so by this time, these things are beginning to work on him. And he is going to be in the midst of death when he dies in 1862. His second daughter, Henrietta, is going to be very ill at that point as well. And all of this will begin to be a part and parcel of what Elizabeth is going to go through as well, because Elizabeth will be pregnant at the time. Sam will die on January the 10th, 1862, and when he dies, she has a miscarriage as a result of that, and Henrietta will die afterwards. So she will suffer the deaths of 3 children and a stillbirth, all of those things together. So Elizabeth loses 3 children and Sam fairly tight together. So if you have ever been in a very bad situation where boom, 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 things happen to you, you might have been in a shadow of a place close to what Elizabeth goes through. So all of those deaths make her a widow in that period of time. The first, William Jarvis Colt, who dies as an infant in 1857, and the only one who's surviving at this point is Caldwell Hart Colt. Caldwell is going to live to be 35 years of age. I won't quite say that he's going to become an adult, but we'll get into that in more detail. But what you see here is going to be Elizabeth's reaction to all of this, because she's got money coming out of her ears, the war is going on, she's got all of this profit, and she could have reached for anything. She could have reached for any brand of painkiller you can imagine and indulged herself tremendously. But that core of faith that she possesses will be her guiding star at this point. And so she will latch on to that. She realizes that she has a family of sorts. She has the factory. She has all of those workers in the factory that depend upon her. And so she will bond with them, and she will build them a church. She will build them the Church of the Good Shepherd, because she knows that certainly she rises above herself at this point in a miraculous way. She is not the only one in this time that is receiving death notices. And she will say, my people here need something, and she will give them that something. She will become that something. And in 1867, she commissions the Church of the Good Shepherd to be built as a memorial to her husband and the 3 children that they lost for all to use. It's built by Edward Tuckerman Potter, and the church's architecture contains guns and gunsmithing tools sculpted in marble to commemorate her husband's life as an armsmaker. It was consecrated in 1869, and Potter will be the architect of the Mark Twain House. And she will begin to step up her connections to the community in this regard. And in that way, I have a partial reminder here for the connections that she has. She works with the Soldiers' Aid Society in 1863 and becomes its president in 1864 here until the end of the war. She also works with the Union for Home Work in 1872, the Wives of Manufacturers, Lawyers, Politicians, and Clergymen, a modern non-denominational sort of outfit. And in 1878, she will work to help systemize a union among the charities to tighten and make more efficient their efforts amongst the poor. And she will also work to become a patroness of the arts with the Hartford Art Society and help to revitalize the Wadsworth Athenaeum and the efforts that they have in deepening an appreciation of the arts. So she is very much a focused and very powerful force in the societal connections here. She is not your average Civil War widow, as I will say. She's also in a very unique position because of all of this, because she will inherit a controlling interest in the manufacturing company worth $3.5 million at the time and closer to $200 million in today's money. So she also has connections with the DAR, of course. So a lot of interesting things she will work with. And of course, one particular connection that I tried to lay earlier and will come back to at this point is that when her husband died, I'm not sure, I don't know yet whether or not she actually had any inkling of his previous connection prior to the time that she and Sam got married. But when that child eventually will get married and marry a girl from Georgia, she will present them with a house almost catty-corner across the street from where she is living along Wethersfield Avenue, and that is the house that she gives them. Now, prior to all of that happening, she does also undergo one last major trauma almost in the shadow of his death, and that is the burning of the factory. 2 years after Sam dies, when the war is still going on, the factory will burn down. February the 5th, 1864, the fire will catch on the upper story of the fire about 7 o'clock in the morning. The newspaper accounts of the fire state, quote, "Flames burst out from the drawing room in the attic, sweeping across the building faster than a man could run, igniting the floors of yellow pine saturated with machine oil." Now, we have two stories on what Elizabeth does at that point. One says that she watches it from Wethersfield Avenue up on the upper tower story of Armsmaker. The other is that she actually comes down and mingles with the folks that are the workers there. I'm not sure which of those it's actually the case. I have heard stories on both sides of that. But her father recorded that she wept at the imagery of the dome finally collapsing into the smoke at that point, because he said it was almost like watching him die again.
Any loss of life?
I'm sorry?
Any loss of life?
Actually, there is one, believe it or not, this is the era when all the workers are still chained into the factory. This is prior to the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire in New York. But nobody dies initially. One guy goes back in to save more stuff, and he is the guy that gets killed. So there's one fellow who dies. And this is a reflection, I think, on the fact that both Sam and Elizabeth are very in with the workers in terms of tending to their needs within, of course, within reason. But one of the things, this is very close to the time that Sam has passed, and so Mrs. Colt is very focused on rebuilding. And so she will want it rebuilt. Now, the fellow in the lower inset there is General William Bule Franklin, who I understand some of you folks might have been familiar with the talk that was done down at the church a while back on Antietam. Well, he wasn't that great on the battlefield. He was a pretty good engineer. And so he will be the fellow who rebuilds at Mrs. Colt's request and pay. Elizabeth's father later described Franklin as, quote, not too dearly purchased. He, like Meade, was a West Point trained architect. So they will have a new factory and a new company. And Mark Twain takes a tour inside that factory in 1868, saying of the rebuilt Colt Armory, on every floor is a dense wilderness of strange iron machines, a tangled forest of rods, bars, pulleys, and wheels, and all the imaginable and unimaginable forms of mechanism. It must have required more brains to invent all those things than would serve to stock 50 senates like ours. Now, during the time that all of this is going on, Elizabeth is doing all of this tremendous social work and being, the top lady in Hartford. As a matter of fact, when she dies, the Current will give her the unheard of honor of having the full front page obituary as First Lady of Connecticut. And it will be rather unique. But before that happens, she is focused very much on trying to raise the remaining Colt son, Caldwell Hart Colt. Collie is the nickname that she gives. Now, unfortunately, what she actually does, I suspect, is impart into him the germ of second-generation rich man syndrome, because he can do no wrong. She loves him to death, literally. And Sam and his surviving son, Caldwell, will have spent just enough time together that Sam will impart to Caldwell his love of the sea, and he really does love sailing. It is what he does the most. It is not what he does the best, because there will be 7 nautical DUIs attributed to him. And that means that she will keep him in liquor and sailboats, which is as bad a combination as liquor and firearms, because you will wind up, seeing these wrecks attributed to him. She does try and bring him into the family business. 1 patent for a shotgun is attributed to him. I'm not sure how much engineering he actually applied to it, or whether somebody just handed him a patent and he applied his signature to it. But he really does like to spend time on the water. Denied little as a young man, ultimately he will rise to the ranks of Commodore of the Larchmont Yacht Club, and he would own outright 5 yachts. When he died at the age of 35, 3 stories would surface: that he either came down with a fatal case of tonsillitis, that he staggered off the stern of his ketch, the Oriole, or that he was fatally shot by a jealous husband. When Mrs. Colt gets news of this, now this would occur in Punta Gorda, Florida. When Mrs. Colt got news of this, she was devastated and directed simply that his body be placed in a casket, the casket be placed on a rail car and shipped to Hartford, and that he be interred with the rest of the family in the grave plot in Cedar Hill Cemetery. No investigation, no nothing. So we do not know. Now, we do know that Mrs. Colt's understandable grief was very deep. Her wallet was very deep. And so another potter masterwork for another dead colt would arise right near the Church of the Good Shepherd. And this is what it initially looked like. She wanted it to look like a yacht. And so it initially had a mast bridge work on the top, which is now gone. And I was told 2 things: either that it was taken down because of maintenance work, or that it was tossed down during a storm. And Jack, you might know.
I've never heard about a storm. I think it was just taken down.
Okay. All right. but it is a marvel of, again, Potter did this. He was called out of retirement to do this. It's got all sorts of little things that talk about his life and his likes and dislikes. The inset of the yacht, for example, is just one of those touches all around. It too serves the community in which it sits. It is available for for use. Just talk to the folks who are there. But it serves the the clergy for the church. It and the church are still owned and operated by the by the folks from the Episcopal Church in this district. So, but it again is a monument of a mother's love for her loss. However, that loss will have its impact because Mrs. Colt now is without an heir to pass the factory and that empire too. And Mrs. Colt struggles with that because now who is going to watch after her people? Who literally is going to feed her lambs? And ultimately, she will sell Colt to a holding company. And a holding company is the equivalent of those people in the Indiana Jones movies who come in to the temple to pry the jeweled eye out of the idol. They are there strictly for the profit motive. And she would write later that she felt like a trespasser whenever she came into that area after she had sold. So that is what her agony is going to be in those last years. Now, one thing though, by that time, Colt is much more than firearms because Sam begins on firearms, but the creation of the assembly line and the development of interchangeable parts are a partial legacy of Sam Colt. Invention, perfection, and worldwide distribution. When we think of Colt today, like we think of Coke or Xerox, in France, their word for handgun is Le Colt. His factory and methods served as industry and laboratory for other creative sorts. Charter Oak lawnmowers, Thompson galley printing presses, Auto Sand dishwashers, buttons, Colt Rock tobacco humidors, and other products. Those others would include people like Amos Pratt, Francis Whitney, and others, including such lights like Henry Ford. All of these would take something from Sam Colt's ideas, precision engineering and assembly, dispersing his ideas into different areas of non-firearms manufacturing. But again, this is all work, and Sam lived a good bit of his life through his work. But his philosophies are another portion of the man, and I want to touch on that briefly as we close. In a letter to his half-brother Bill in the early 1840s, indentured by his half-brother Bill's belief that because Sam was spending so much time with politicians when Sam was trying to get a contract, that Sam must be successful in brown-nosing these politicians. His half-brother Bill was looking for a government job, and so he wanted an in for a government job. And Sam wrote back, said, "I will aid you, but not in the way you want." He said, "Don't, for the sake of your own good name, think again of being a subordinate officer of government. You had better blow your brains out at once and manure some honest man's ground with your carcass than to hang your ambition on so low a peg. Life is a thing to be enjoyed. It is the only certainty in its proportion to our achievement, so let it yield its fruits to our appetites. Let your aim be high. You are the best judge of your own abilities. It is far better to be at the head of a louse than the tail of a lion. And if I can't be first, I won't be second in anything." So that, whoops, I went too far once. There we go. I must have cut my slide out. Well, going back to the opening image you had of Sam Colt there in the picture, that Sam Colt is rife with characters, or America is rife with characters, and this nation, over her rich history, has been gifted with more than her share. Sam Colt, during his short life, became a revolutionary figure within an unhappily necessary industry. During his times, efficient arms were deemed required, and Colt's gift was to provide them. In this role, he was not alone, but he was unique and undeniably controversial. He was an American original. Yes.
Can you give us an update on the Colt National Park? Where are we now? Any dates when it will be open?
The final step is something called establishment, and from what my boss tells me, from what Superintendent Woolsey tells me, is that we are much closer to the final establishment than we were, but I do not know as yet exactly where that is. So if you can define that, that's the problem we keep having, is apparently we get close to that, and we're still close to that, but we're not quite done with that. So that's as definite as I can give you. I apologize for that indefinitiveness, but this is my Ron Nesson impression. For those of us who remember who Ron Nesson was, but we're much closer along than we were, but we're not quite there yet.
How long will you be in town giving your tours on the weekends?
Every weekend I do the tours on Saturday and Sunday, 10 o'clock and 2 o'clock. And the last day of tours is the 17th of September.
And they're great. If none of you have been on it, I highly recommend. Your tour was wonderful. We did it last year.
Thank you, ma'am.
A lot of people think of Eli Whitney and the Whitney families as the inventor of interchangeable parts, particularly back in the 1790s and early 1800s. And that raises the question of how much Samuel Colt may have borrowed from these early inventors, innovators in machine tool technology. And how much did he borrow, and who did he borrow from?
That's a fair question. And in those days, there was a pool, if you will, of people who had that sort of knowledge, and they kind of swilled around each other as far as that went. Eli Whitney, John Hall, all those people kind of, communed in that regard. But there's a particular story regarding Eli Whitney and the firearms patent. First of all, Eli Whitney Sr. Got cheated on the cotton gin. And so it is widely known that they gave him the patent on interchangeability of parts for firearms as a sop, as not as an apology for not giving him the cotton gin patent. But when Whitney goes up to the patent office, he has 10 muskets. And he strips down these 10 muskets into a big pile, and then he reassembles them, and then on that merit he gets the firearms patent. What is not generally known is that each one of those key parts in those 10 muskets has very small markings on it so that Whitney knows which pieces go to which guns. And what Colt was able to do is to finalize those pieces and make sure that it doesn't matter which pieces go to which guns. Yes.
Two questions. One, why does Colt come back from Paterson, New Jersey to Hartford to build his next factory? And then B, why does he build it in the floodplain?
Why does he do what?
Build it in the floodplain.
Okay, he builds it in the floodplain because land is cheap, and he's going to build a dike. And initially what he had hoped to do was to share the investment cost by having other folks come down. He had the vision of an industrial park like we all think of industrial parks today, but nobody else was willing to take the risk. And he figured that if he built his dike well enough that it would resist that now, and that he was proven wrong. But he came back to Hartford because he was a Hartford boy. He was born here. and this was his town. So those were the reasons. Okay. Okay.